So a few years ago, I was contacted as the chaplain to go make a notification to a father whose son in a different state had passed away. And the address was out in Enumclaw, kind of in a rural area. And got to the address, and there was a gate across the road. And the house was set back off the road maybe 100 yards, and could see nothing. And there was no phone at the house. So I climbed through the gate, and I started walking up there. I was wearing this jacket, so I was hoping that nobody would shoot me as a prowler. And went around to the side of the house, and the windows were kind of boarded up, and I started calling, knocking on the door, and didn't hear anything. Walked around the other side of the house. I was calling, hello, hello, and I heard dogs. And I looked around, and I saw a leaf rake. And I backed up against the wall like this with the leaf rake, and around the corner came two dogs, a Rottweiler and a Pit Bull. And they saw me, and they smiled. Not in a friendly way, but in a way that said, oh boy, this is going to be fun. And I was trying to think how this leaf rake is going to save me from mortal harm. And then someone called the dogs, and they looked really dejected. And they trotted around the house. So I want to talk about fear this morning. I'm not going to keep wearing this because I feel funny in it. But I want to talk about fear this morning, which is interesting in light of what was shared. And fear is a perfectly natural thing that happens to every single one of us. It was perfectly natural for me to respond in fear. And we hear a lot of reports about people in fear. We talk about courage, and we hear descriptions as to that courage isn't the absence of fear, but it's what you do in the midst of fear. And what I want to do with you this morning is look at three stories in the New Testament that talk about fear and courage and explain to us how our relationship to God the Creator, because of what Jesus Christ did, helps us to understand courage and fear on a different level. So the first story is in the book of Mark, and it's in the 4th chapter of Mark. You can turn there if you want. We're going to be flipping around a bit here. And these three stories illustrate three areas, and I think maybe they're the three primary areas in which we struggle with fear. So I'm going to start reading with verse 35, chapter 4 of Mark. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side of the lake. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, and just as he was in the boat, there were also others' boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drowned? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. So the first source of where our fears come from are from things in creation, like spiders and snakes and bees and things that poke us or want to bite us. And our perfectly natural defense to those things is to resist that. But those things can also become sort of an obsession with us. They can become something which we were never intended to continue to be afraid of. It's fascinating to me that Jesus said in this example that the base of their fear wasn't in the danger of the storm. The basis of their fear was in their absence of faith. It's fascinating to me also that Jesus was able to calm that storm and rebuke that storm. And it makes me wonder if there is certain connections to creation that we are supposed to have. I don't know whether he did that as a human or whether he did that as God, whether that was the God part of him, or whether there is something there that maybe we are supposed to be more connected to nature than we even imagine. But the truth is that naturally, there are certain things that we are supposed to be afraid of. You're supposed to be afraid when vicious dogs come around the corner. But how you respond to that has to do with your relationship to the Creator and really your relationship to the creation as well. Just this morning, I took Abby out, and she smelled something. I could tell when she walked out the door, her nose was high in the air, her tail was up, and she ran out to the fence and she was sniffing, and then suddenly she realized what it was she smelled. And she turned around and she couldn't get past me fast enough to get back in the house. I have no idea what was out there. There have been a bobcat around. There has been a bear around. I didn't see anything. I walked out and looked. But whatever it was, she knew it was best at that point to be in the house. And then she turned around and looked at me and said, "Come on, stupid, get in here." But our relationship to fear has a reflection on our relationship to God, the Creator, because He put all these things on this planet. And if we constantly fear the very things or hate or despise the very things He created, it is a reflection, I believe, on our relationship to the Creator. And I'm not saying that you should never swat a mosquito. I'm not saying that you shouldn't kill houseflies when they're in your house. But I think that there is something about our relationship to God that should make us at least pause anytime we are confronted with life, whether it's scary or not, and say, what am I supposed to be in relationship to this? And what does that say about what I really feel about God the Creator? Is there something here that I'm missing? Is there a message in my fear that's telling me something about myself that I need to resolve with God? Let's go to the next story. The next story is in the book of Luke. And it's in the 4th chapter as well. Luke chapter 4. And I'm going to start reading with verse 14. Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself,' and you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard you did in Capernaum.' Truly I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was severe famine throughout the land, yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Sepharth in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha and the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up and drove him out of the town, took him to the brow of the hill in which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Now, what's fascinating to me in this story, I love this story, is that he's coming back home. They've heard these reports. He's going around. He's doing miracles. He's doing miraculous things. He comes home, and they're all excited to see, Joseph's boy, Mary's boy. And he's a rabbi now, and he sits down. He reads these great passages, and they're all going, "Oh, it's so nice." And then he suddenly says, "But you know what? You guys aren't special. You're not special at all. God loves the whole world. And immediately their tenure changes from he's so nice to they are so furious with him, they decide they're literally going to throw him off a cliff and kill him. Now, studies have been done, and they have concluded that the greatest fear that humans have is the fear of speaking in public. It's greater than their fear of death. Now, granted, if somebody took a gun and put it to your head, you'd probably speak in public rather than be shot. But I think what they're saying, as you think about dying, you're less afraid of dying than you are of standing up here and speaking to people. And most of you would probably nod your head and say, yeah, a few of you would say, no, that's not true of me. But that is, statistically, the largest fear among our society is speaking in front of people. So here Jesus is speaking in front of people, and not only is he speaking in front of people, but he is confronting them, and he is dividing truth from error. So what is it about us that is so terrified of humans? What is it about us that is so fearful to speak? And I believe that this is a fear which is not normal, which is not part of our physical being. It's not something which God imprinted in us. I think that that fear is actually the work of the fall. It's actually the work of the evil one. It's actually the work of our defected self. And it is actually the result of the voices speaking to us and saying that we are less than everyone else around us, that we're not special, that other people are better than we are, that somehow there are certain classes of people that God makes distinctions between them. Now, what's really, really interesting to me in all this, Jesus just kind of goes along with this. I just would love to have been there because he just kind of lets them take him all the way out to the edge of the hill, and he's standing there on the edge of the cliff, and they're getting ready to throw him off, and it says what? He walked right through them. He just turned and walked right through them. They had absolutely no ability to touch him beyond that. And I think that gives us a great truth in realizing that there is absolutely no one on this planet that is better than we are. That there is no one that has more of a right to speak than we do. That there is no one who has greater wisdom, greater thoughts, greater things to share than we do. And I believe that this is a fear that every follower of Jesus Christ should address. And you people are the best ones in the world to deal with this fear. Because most of you are introverts. And for introverts, the fear scale is way higher. Right? Do you agree? Yeah. But you know what? God puts you in a loving congregation. Every Sunday, he gives you an opportunity to trust him with this fear during sharing time, right? The other thing that he does is he gave you the chief of introverts to stand in front of you every week. The guy who would never say anything in high school and college. The guy who walked around looking at the ground all the time. And every week God says, look, here's the guy who is more introverted than you are, and he stands up here every Sunday, and he talks for half the service he's up there talking. All I'm asking is you to take 30 seconds, write something on a piece of paper, and read it during the sharing time, and begin to conquer this fear, because introverts have so much depth to share. But they cling and they hold it in. We hear what's going on in the extroverts' lives all the time, but we need to hear from the introverts because you're hearing things that the other guys are not hearing. So, the way that this fear can be overcome is through little increment steps. Start writing a list of verse down. Determine that you're going to just share a verse of Scripture next Sunday. Determine that you're just going to write a little note about something that happened and read it. My first sermons were all very carefully outlined down to the word. don't use them anymore because I've done it long enough. All right, let's hear one more story. You're all convicted about that, I can tell. At least some of you. The last story is also in Luke, and it's in chapter 22, starting with verse 39. Luke 22, it says, this is at the end of Jesus' ministry, right after the Last Supper with his disciples. And it says that he went down to the Garden of Edens. Jesus went as usual to the Mount of Olives, and went to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone beyond them and knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he arose from prayer and went back to his disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he said. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." The last fear that I want to talk to you about is the fear of death. And this is something that obviously Jesus is agonizing with. And this is, again, a very natural fear. I mean, you don't want to die, and that's something that God has placed into your heart. He has sunk into your very genetic system. You don't want to die, and it's very natural. From that, you have a fear of death. That fear that I had when those two dogs came around the corner, that was perfectly natural. There are many, many occasions in our life when you go, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that just happened to me. That car almost hit me." But when it becomes unusual is when you begin to start having distress about it. When I was a young person, I remember used to wake up in the night when we were early married, and I would lie there just in terror that I was going to die, that I was dying. I literally thought at that moment I was dying. I would just lie there in terror of the thought of dying. And it took me quite a few years to get beyond that. And but there was a great deal of prayer and a great deal of fasting, a great deal of seeking God and saying, "God, release me from this terror. I don't want to be that kind of person anymore." And I, for the most part, am not afraid to die anymore. I don't want to die. And I don't know how I would react if, somebody came running at me with a hatchet. I'm sure I would be nervous and try to get away. But for the most part, I'm not overly concerned about dying. But where my fear is moved to is beyond me. For example, when my grandkids stay overnight at my house, I cannot close the bedroom door if their parents are. If their parents are here, fine, whatever. But if I'm taking care of my grandkids and they're in the house somewhere, in fact, I remember the first times that they would spend the night, I would get up 3 or 4 times in the night just to walk in there and listen to make sure they were still breathing. I could hardly sleep. Of course, also influenced by the fact that as a chaplain, I've been to many, many sites where children didn't survive the night. So that certainly fed that fear. But that's a fear that I honestly am still wrestling with. There's another fear, and that is of my children dying. And also of losing my spouse. Used to be when she would go away, I would just be beside myself the whole time she was gone. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Just this week, she went to a meeting one evening, and right after she left, I heard sirens going down our road. And those old feelings came back. And I had to bring myself back to the promise. And this is how God has helped me with that fear. His promise, again and again, that he says to me is, they're not your family. You're just taking care of them, and I am in charge of them. I'm the one that's going to determine when every one of those people decide, when I bring them home, not you. I'm going to be the one that decides how long your wife's going to live, not you. All of your worry, all of your anxiety is not going to make her live another second longer. You need to give that fear to me. And so I'm getting way better at that. I'm working through that. But that is a fear also that all of us, I'm suspecting, wrestle with, and I believe that God wants you to free from that. Fear of your own death and fear of the death of the people that love you. Now, there's a fascinating common denominator in all three of these fears that I want to just kind of climax on. And that is, before each one of these, there's a period where Jesus spends intensive time in prayer. Before the journey across the lake, he'd been up in the mountains to pray. Before he went back to Nazareth, he was in the desert for 30 days, fasting and praying and seeking God. And then before he goes to the cross, this whole account is of him in the garden, praying and seeking God. And so the common denominator in any of our fears is that connection to the living God. That you won't have victory over these fears simply through using psychological techniques. You may have some success, but ultimately the great success is going to be from your connection to God. And as Jesus said to the very first story to his disciples, this fear is a barometer of your spirituality. This fear that you have is telling me something about your relationship to God, the Creator. And so, you can choose to deal with any of these fears or not. You can just say, well, that's just who I am. It's my nature. I'm a fearful person. I got stung by scorpions. The rest of my life, I'm going to be afraid of scorpions. You can choose that fear, or you can choose the path of freedom from it. So, you know what? I don't want that part of my life anymore. I want to be free. I want to be like Noel. I want to say, God, give me freedom. We're going to conclude the service a little differently. I want you to just bow your head. And the worship team is going to come, and they're going to sing a song. And during this time, I want you just to talk to God about your fears, about what he would like for you to do with them. And when the song is over, no one's going to say anything. When you're done, you can get up. That'll be the end. So a few years ago, I was contacted as the chaplain to go make a notification to a father whose son in a different state had passed away. And the address was out in Enumclaw, kind of in a rural area. And got to the address, and there was a gate across the road. And the house was set back off the road maybe 100 yards, and could see nothing. And there was no phone at the house. So I climbed through the gate, and I started walking up there. I was wearing this jacket, so I was hoping that nobody would shoot me as a prowler. And went around to the side of the house, and the windows were kind of boarded up, and I started calling, knocking on the door, and didn't hear anything. Walked around the other side of the house. I was calling, hello, hello, and I heard dogs. And I looked around, and I saw a leaf rake. And I backed up against the wall like this with the leaf rake, and around the corner came two dogs, a Rottweiler and a Pit Bull. And they saw me and they smiled. Not in a friendly way, but in a way that said, oh boy, this is going to be fun. And I was trying to think how this leaf rake is going to save me from mortal harm. And then someone called the dogs, and they looked really dejected. And they trotted around the house. So I want to talk about fear this morning. I'm not going to keep wearing this because I feel funny in it. But I want to talk about fear this morning, which is interesting in light of what was shared. And fear is perfectly natural thing that happens to every single one of us. It was perfectly natural for me to respond in fear. And we hear a lot of reports about people in fear. We talk about courage, and we hear descriptions as to that courage isn't the absence of fear, but it's what you do in the midst of fear. And what I want to do with you this morning is look at three stories in the New Testament that talk about fear and courage and explain to us how our relationship to God the Creator, because of what Jesus Christ did, helps us to understand courage and fear on a different level. So the first story is in the book of Mark, and it's in the 4th chapter of Mark. You can turn there if you want. We're going to be flipping around a bit here. And these three stories illustrate three areas, and I think maybe they're the three primary areas in which we struggle with fear. So I'm going to start reading with verse 35, chapter 4 of Mark. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, and just as he was in the boat, there were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drowned?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." So the first source where our fears come from are from things in creation, like spiders and snakes and bees and things that poke us or want to bite us. And our perfectly natural defense to those things is to resist that. But those things can also become sort of an obsession with us. They can become something which we were never intended to continue to be afraid of. It's fascinating to me that Jesus said in this example that the base of their fear wasn't in the danger of the storm. The basis of their fear was in their absence of faith. It's fascinating to me also that Jesus was able to calm that storm and rebuke that storm. And it makes me wonder if there is certain connections to creation that we are supposed to have. I don't know whether he did that as a human or whether he did that as God, whether that was the God part of him, or whether there is something there.
Girl's diary of the day.
Supposed to be more connected to
Tonight I thought my boyfriend was acting weird. We'd made plans to meet at a nice restaurant for dinner. I was shopping with friends all day long, so I thought he was upset at the fact that I was a bit late, but he made no comment about it. Conversation wasn't flowing, so I suggested that we go somewhere quiet so we could talk. He agreed, but he didn't say much. I asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. I asked him if it was my fault that he was upset. He said he wasn't upset and it had nothing to do with me and not to worry about it.
Something. I could tell when she walked
On the way home, I told him I loved him. He smiled slightly and kept driving. I can't explain his behavior. I don't know why he didn't say I love you too. I feel as though I've lost him completely, as if he wanted nothing to do with me.
I have no idea.
I don't know what to do. I'm sure his thoughts are with someone else. My life is a disaster.
I didn't see anything. I walked out and looked.
Boyfriend's diary, same day.
She knew it was best.
A 1-foot putt. Who misses a 1-foot putt?
And
I'm so irritated.
And said,
"Come on, stupid, get in here."
But our relationship to fear,
it's really easy
a
to misunderstand people,
relationship to
misunderstand someone.
Because he put all
and it
these
seems
things
that
on
once
this
you
planet.
have a misunderstanding about someone, it's really hard to get
the
rid
very
of
things
that.
or hate the or
First
despise
impression,
the
that
very
first
things he
idea.
created.
I've encountered
It is
people
a
that I immediately
reflection, I
thought,
believe,
this is
on
somebody that
our
I'm going to have a
relationship
really
to
difficult
creator.
time getting to know.
And,
They just seemed kind of aloof,
I'm
kind
not
of
saying that you
distant.
should never swat a mosquito.
But then as they started talking, I
I'm
realized
not
they
saying that,
completely misunderstood them.
you
And the
should
opposite
kill
has been true. I
houseflies
thought,
when
this
in
is
your
somebody
house.
I'm going to really
But
enjoy.
I
And then they
think
started
that
talking about
there is
some of their
something
values and
about
what's
our
important to them. I
relationship
thought,
to
yeah,
God
well,
that
we're not
should make us at
nearly
least
have
pause
so much in common as I
anytime we're
thought.
confronted with life.
And the same thing is true
Whether it's scary
about
or
many
not.
of our concepts of God.
said,
And so
what am I
we've been
supposed to be in
approaching
relationship to God?
different
So what does
ideas
that
about
say
God and
about
what our
whether we feel
misunderstandings
like
about
God?
Him have been. And
Is there
I
something
keep
here
bringing
that
you
I'm
back
missing?
to this idea
Is there a message in
that
my fear
Jesus
that's
is really the
telling me
litmus
something about
test,
myself
that we need to look at God
I need to
through
resolve with God?
the life of Christ, through the
go to the
sayings
next
of Christ, through the things that He had
The
illustrated.
next story is in the book of Luke.
But even that can be kind of a problem, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But one of the misconceptions that
And
we
it's in
have
the
about
4th
God
chapter as
is that
well.
God is somewhere other.
Luke chapter 4.
And a lot of our verbiage is about that. We talk about God coming down. We talk about God being present. present, that we really felt the presence
I'm going to
of
start
God.
reading with verse 14.
We talk about
Jesus
the fact
returned
that
to Galilee in the power of the Spirit.
there are even some
and
biblical
news about him
images that
spread
we've
through the whole
distorted, and we
countryside.
see God
He
sitting
was
on a
teaching in
throne
their
and
synagogues, and
Jesus on
everyone
his right
praised
hand,
him.
and so we kind of
He
have
went
this
to
picture of God
Nazareth,
as
where
being
he
this
had been brought up,
elderly
and on the
man,
Sabbath
and
day
we've
he went
assigned
into
him
the
gender.
synagogue, as
God
was his
has-
custom.
He's a old,
He stood
he's a
up to
man,
read,
and he's God,
and the
and he
scroll
sits
of
in
the
heaven,
prophet
and he looks
Isaiah
down
was
on us.
handed to him.
And
Unrolling it, he found the
we
place
tend to
where
read
it
the
is
Bible
written,
that way as
the Spirit
well,
of the Lord
because
is
we
on me,
look at the
because
Bible
he has
and we look for the
anointed me to
occasions when
proclaim
God
good
came
news
and
to the
presented
poor.
himself to humans.
He has sent me to
You know, he showed
proclaim
up for
freedom for the
Abraham,
prisoners
and
and
then there was
recovery
quite
of sight
some
for the
time, and
blind,
when he showed
to
up
set
for
the oppressed
Moses,
free, to
and
proclaim
then,
the
and
year
then
of the
after
Lord's
Moses, there's
favor.
a little bit of an
Then
interlude
he
with
rolled up the
Joshua,
scroll,
but after
gave
that,
it
there's
back to
literally
the attendant,
hundreds of
and
years
sat down.
where God seems to be off.
The
going
eyes
on a
of everyone in the synagogue were
He's not
fastened
around,
on
he's
him.
not talking to
He
anyone,
began
and
by
he shows
saying to
up
them, "Today
for
the scripture
Samuel."
is fulfilled in
And,
your hearing."
It's sort
All
of,
spoke,
and we
all
also use
spoke well of
in
him and were
verbiage
amazed
like
at the
second
gracious
coming
words
of
that came
Jesus,
from his
like
lips.
God's going to be coming
Isn't
back.
this Joseph's son? They
He's
asked.
away,
Jesus
but he's
said
coming
to
back.
them,
And so we're praying to
"Surely
him
you'll
somewhere
quote this
where he is
proverb
out
to
there,
me,
and
Physician,
we're
heal
hoping that
yourself, and
occasionally
you will
his
tell me,
presence,
do
his
here
spirit
in
will
your
be here, but we know
hometown
that
what
someday
you have
we'll actually
heard,
be in
what we have
God's
heard you
presence.
did in Capernaum.
And we'll get to hang
Truly
out
I
with God.
tell you," he continued,
You
"no
understand the
prophet
verbiage
is
I'm talking
accepted
about?
in his hometown.
And it's kind of
I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in
literally
Elijah's
by the
time
life of
when the
Christ
sky was
himself.
shut
And
for
here's what I
3.5
mean by
years,
Jesus
and there was
comes,
severe
he
famine
is the
throughout the
Son of
land,
God,
yet
he's the image of
Elijah
God,
was
he's the
not
living
sent
of
to
God,
any of
but he's
them.
only here like for 30 years.
But to a
And of
widow
those
in
30 years, we
Sepharth
really
in the
only
region
know
of Sidon.
somewhere between
And there were many
1
in
and 3
Israel with
years
leprosy in the
of his
time of
existence.
Elisha and the prophet.
And it's
Yet
further
not one of them was
complicated by
cleansed,
all these
only
scriptures.
Naaman
Let me
the
just
Syrian.
share some of these with you. In
All
Mark
the people
chapter
in the
1,
synagogue
4,
were
34, it
furious
says,
when they heard
Jesus
this.
healed many who
They
had
got
various
up and drove him
diseases.
out of
He
the
also
town,
drove out many
took him to
demons,
the
but he
brow
would
of the
not
hill on
let
which
the
the
demons
town was
speak
built
because he knew
in
who
order
he
to
was.
throw him off the
And
cliff.
so on many occasions,
But he walked right
he tells
through the
people,
crowd
don't
and
say
went
anything
on
about
his
who I
way.
am.
Now, what's
In Matthew
fascinating to me
16:20,
in the
he
story, I
warned
love
his
this story,
disciples,
is
don't
that
tell anybody
he's coming
about
back home.
Christ.
He's
Keep it a
they've
secret.
heard these reports. He's going around.
And then
he's doing
in,
miracles.
again
doing
in Mark
miraculous
4,
things.
there's this man with leprosy.
He comes home and they're all
and
excited
after
to
he
see,
cures
you know,
him and he
Joseph's
wants to
boy,
worship him,
Mary's
he
boy.
says, no, don't
And
say
he's a
it.
rabbi
Go
now,
show
and he
yourself
sits
to the
down and he
priest
reads
and
these
don't
great
tell
passages, and
anybody
they're all
about
going,
what's
"Oh,
happened."
it's so nice."
So
And then he suddenly says, "But you know what?
Jesus is
You guys aren't
constantly
special.
warning people,
You're not
don't
special
mention
at
the
all.
fact that I did
God
this
loves
for
the
you.
whole world."
And
Immediately their tenure
there are a lot of commentators
changes
and
from,
theologians who
"He's so
say, well,
nice,"
the
to,
reason
"They
that
are
Jesus
so
did this
furious
is
with him,
because the crowds
they
would have been
decide
so
they're
huge, he
literally
wouldn't have
gonna
been able
throw
to
him off the
accomplish what he
cliff
was
and
trying to
kill him.
accomplish. And he didn't want
Now-
things to happen any sooner than they were supposed to happen.
Studies have been
And I
done,
suppose that's a good
and they
good
have
explanation as any, but it
concluded
also
that the
leaves you with the
greatest
impression
fear
that God
that
doesn't
humans
really
have
want us to
is the
have
fear
an
of
intimate
speaking
relationship
in
with him.
public.
He's just here for a little bit,
It's
and then he
greater
zips
than their
off
fear
again
of death.
somewhere else.
Now, granted, if somebody took a gun and put it to your head,
And it leaves a
you'd
lot of
probably speak in
questions
public rather
if
than
you
be
have
shot.
that type
But I
of
think
a
what they're
God.
saying, as you think about dying,
Because
you're less afraid
you look
of
at the
dying
world
than
and you
you
look at
are
all the
standing up
problems
here
and you
and
say,
speaking
why did
to
God
people.
make this mess and then go off and just
And
leave it?
most
he's
of you
going to come
probably
back
nod
someday
your
and
head and
fix
say,
it.
yeah,
But
few
what
of you
about
say,
in
"No, that's
between
not
now
true."
and then?
But that
What about
is
my life right
statistically
now?
the
And
largest
literally,
fear
this is
among our
such a problem to
society
some
is
people that
speaking
they
in front of people.
abandon the idea of God.
So here Jesus is speaking
They
in front of people. And
finally
not only is
just
he
give up and
speaking
say,
in front
"Yeah,
of
you know
people,
what? If
but
this is
he
how
is
God is,
confronting
I don't
them,
think I
and
even
he is
believe he
dividing
exists."
truth from error.
I remember
So what is it about us that is so
N.T. Wright
terrified
was a chaplain
of
at
humans? What
Cambridge
is
or
it about
Oxford, I
us
forget
is
which one.
so fearful
And he was the
to
chaplain.
speak?
He was professor there, but he was also the chaplain, and
I
one of his
believe
jobs was to meet with the
That
new
this is a
students. I think I told
fear
you this story before, but I'll do it
which
again.
is not
And
normal,
he
which
said that
is
oftentimes
not
he would
part
meet
of our
these new students that are coming into this
being.
religious
It's not something which
organization,
God
and he would say, you know
imprinted
what,
in us. I think
I'm happy to
that
meet you,
that
but I have to
fear
confess to you
is
that I'm
actually actually
don't
the
believe in
work of the
God.
fall. It's actually the
And
work
so
of the
he would
evil one.
often
It's
say,
actually
okay,
the
well,
work
tell me about
of
this
our
God that you
defected
don't believe in.
self.
He says, well,
And
he's
it's
up in
actually
heaven,
a
and he's
result of
looking
the
down
voices
on us, and
speaking
he's
to us
watching
and
what we're
saying
doing.
that we are less
And,
than everyone else around us.
I just don't believe that. And he
That
would say,
we're
yeah, I
not
don't believe in
special.
that God either. And they would go, what? We have a
Other
chaplain who's
people
an
are better
atheist.
than we are.
And
That
so they
somehow
would go and
there
explain
are
to
certain
him, to
classes
them,
of people that God makes
the reality of
distinctions
God.
between them.
But we still have these
Now, what's
lingering
really interesting
concepts
to me
of
in all
God,
this,
which
you know,
really
Jesus
go
just kind of
back
goes along with
to,
this. I just would love to have been there because he just kind of lets them
Greek
take him all the way out to the edge of
mythology
the hill, and he's standing
of the
there on the edge
gods
of the
being
cliff.
up there somewhere
they're
watching
getting ready to
us
throw
and
him
paying
off, and it
attention, and
says
we've
what?
limited it down to simply one God, but we still
Walked
have
right
this
through them.
erroneous
turn
idea
and
that
walk
he's
right
up
through them.
there and we're down
They had
here,
absolutely no
and
ability
someday
to
in
touch him
eternity we will
beyond
go
that.
up there where he is.
And I think that gives
I remember
us
when
a
the first
great
Russian
clue
astronaut went
in
into space.
realizing
I
that there
was
is
alive then,
absolutely no
actually.
one on this planet.
And I remember in the news, one of the things that he proclaimed is that he
there is
looked
no
around
one
and
that has
God didn't,
more of a
wasn't up
right
there.
to speak than we
So he
do.
obviously didn't
That there is
exist.
no
And so
one who has greater
that
wisdom, greater
obviously
thought,
came
greater
out
things to
of
share
understanding
than we
that he'd gotten from Christians
And I believe
who
that
God
this is a
was
fear
and
that
where he
every
exists.
follower of Jesus Christ should
our
address. And
understanding.
you people are the best
The Bible
ones in
gives
the
us a different
world
picture of God
to
if
deal
you
with
look
this fear.
closely and if you don't have that
Because most of
perception.
you are introverts.
The Bible gives us
And for
an
introverts,
understanding that
the
God
fear scale
isn't
is way
someone who is
higher.
absent from creation, but
Right?
is
You
literally
agree?
present in creation.
But you know what?
That literally the
God
force
puts you
that
in a loving
holds all of
congregation.
creation, Colossians
Every
says,
Sunday,
the atoms,
he
the
gives you
power
an
that
opportunity
causes all of these
to
things
trust him
in creation
with this
to
fear
exist
during
are
sharing
held
time,
together
right?
by
The other thing that he
person
does
of
is
the Creator God.
he gave you the chief
Now,
of
This makes some people
introverts
nervous because
to
it sounds like
stand in front of you
pantheism.
every week.
But the difference is
The
that
guy
the Bible
who would
says
never
this
say
is not an
anything in high
impersonal
school
God.
and
It's not an
college. The guy
impersonal
who
force.
walked around
It is a
looking at the
God
ground
that
all
is
the time.
filled with
And
passion,
every week
which
God
is filled
says,
with
"Look,
emotion, which is filled with
here's the guy
creativity,
who is
which is
more
filled with
further than you are."
intention.
He stands
And
up
Jesus
here every
said when he
Sunday,
came into
and
Jerusalem,
talks
if you
for
guys hadn't said
long,
something,
half the service he's up
the
there
rocks
talking.
themselves would have erupted.
All I'm asking is
Because
you
those
take
rocks were
30
filled with the
seconds,
presence, the
write
power
something on
of
a piece of
God. The
paper,
power of God is
and
what
read it
literally
during the
holds
sharing
this
time.
planet
and
and all
begin
of its
to
molecules
conquer this
together.
fear, because
And that's the God that we worship. I remember
Introverts
one time we did a prayer exercise where we set up a
much
chair
depth to share.
and we sat around it. We said,
But they
okay,
cling and they hold
think
it
I was
in.
leading this, and I said, okay, let's
we
imagine
hear
that
what's
God
going
is
on in the
sitting in the
extroverts' lives
chair.
all the time.
I
But
did
we
that
need
just
to
because
hear
I
from
wanted
the
us to
introverts,
direct
because you're
our
hearing things
prayers
that
to
the
something
other
which is
guys
more
are not
tangible.
hearing.
But I could have just as easily said this,
So,
imagine God is the chair. Because
The way
all
that
of those
this
things which hold
fear
a
can be
chair into
overcome
being are literally the
is through
presence
little
of the Creator
increment
God.
steps. Start
Now, why is
writing
this important?
List a verse down.
Because
Determine that you're
as a
gonna just
part
share
of
verse
creation
Scripture next Sunday.
and God
Determine that
being
you're just
in
gonna
all of
write
this
a little
creation,
note about
He
something
created
that happened
humans
and read it.
for two reasons.
My first sermons were
And one of those
all
reasons was to
very
care
carefully
for all the creation.
outlined down to the
And
word.
the other reason was for us to care for
use
each
them
other
anymore
in the midst of
because
that.
I've done it long
And those two things were
All right.
our worship of Him,
Let's hear one more
the
story.
Creator God. Of
You're all
this
convicted
amazing
about that, I
universe.
can tell. At least some of you.
So when you talk about why God allows
The last
pain
story
to
is
happen,
also in Luke.
it's
and it's
more
in
accurate
chapter,
to say that the pain
22,
on this planet
starting
is the results
with
of humans
verse
refusing
39.
to accept what God has laid out for them to do. When you see the pollution, when you see the
Luke
pain, when you see the
22, it
heartache, when
says,
you see
this is at the
people
end of
not
Jesus' ministry, right after
getting
the
along, it's
Last
because
Supper
they
with
have
his
stopped
disciples.
worshiping the
And it says
Creator
that he
and
went
have
down to
stopped,
the Garden of
started
Eden.
looking toward things
Jesus
like
went as
power,
usual to the
toward
Mount of
money,
Olives,
toward
and his
wealth,
disci-
toward
not Garden of
pursuing
Eden, sorry.
egocentricity.
Went to the
caring
Mount of
about
Olives,
themselves
and
more
his
than anything
disciples
else.
followed
And
him.
God says our
On
first
reaching the
primary
place, he
role
said
is
to them,
care
"Pray that you will not fall
for
into
one another and
temptation."
to love one another, and to
withdrew
love
about a
His
stone
amazing
beyond
creation.
them and knelt
And
down
in
and
that
prayed.
sense, we
"Father,
are
if you're
loving
willing,
the
take
Creator
this cup
himself."
from me, yet not my will, but
And
yours
that
be done.
simply
An
takes the
angel
blame
from
away from
heaven
God and
appeared
puts
to
it
him and strengthened
squarely
him,
upon
and
us.
being in anguish, he prayed
are
more
the ones who are
earnestly,
responsible.
and his sweat was like drops of blood
Obviously, we
falling to
have
the ground.
spiritual
When he arose
forces
from
that
prayer,
are
went
are
back to
working
his
with us
disciples, he
toward-
found them asleep,
to the destruction of
exhausted
the
from
creation.
sorrow.
They're
Why are you
they the
sleeping? He
antithesis
said,
of
"Get
the
up and
goodness
pray
of
so that
God.
you will not
and
fall
so
into
they are
temptation."
delighted when we
The last fear that I want to talk to you
partner
about is
with
the fear
them
of death.
to do this destruction of each
And,
other and literally of creation itself.
This is something that obviously Jesus is agonizing with. And this is, again, a very natural fear.
I'm
I
telling
mean,
you this
you
because I want you
don't
to
want to
stop
die, and that's
praying
something that
to the
God
in
has
heaven.
placed into your
I
heart.
want you to stop
He has
worshiping
sunk into
some
your very
remote,
genetic
distant
system.
God and inviting
You
him to come
don't
down
want to
into
die,
your
and,
life.
and it's very natural
I'm
from
saying this
that you have
because
a
I
fear of
want
death.
you to